So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the topDNS Best Practice webinar, part 12, Beyond the Perimeter. There are still people joining the room. The webinar will begin shortly. Please hold the line. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the topDNS Best Practice webinar, part 12, Beyond the Perimeter, Managing Internet Routing as a Supply Chain Risk in collaboration with Manners today. There are still people joining the room, but I think we can start with an introduction. So my name is Lars Steffen. I'm the head of Digital Infrastructures and Resilience at the ECO Association. And this webinar is held under the umbrella of the topDNS initiative. I've got the pleasure to have two excellent speakers today with me. So the first one is Andrei Rabushevsky. He is the technical director of the Internet Integrity Program at the Global Cyber Alliance, also one of the partners of the topDNS initiative. And also with us is Matthew Dowie. He's the Chief Network Architect at Visa. Hi, Matthew. Thank you for being with us today. And before we dive into substance, I would like to briefly take you through our housekeeping rules. So, of course, this is a webinar. So the webinar will be recorded, and the recording will also be available shortly after the meeting. Those who are participating in this webinar will receive a follow-up email shortly after the webinar, including the link to the recording, but also including the slides that will be used during the webinar. You're muted throughout the webinar, but of course, you are more than welcome to submit questions. So you can use the questions pod of the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side. You can see the questions pod where you can type in your question and I will monitor the queue, but you can also submit your question verbally by clicking on the raising your hand button. Of course, we will unmute you, and it would be kind if you could state your name and your affiliation before you address your question. After the webinar, there will be a short survey that will be displayed when you close the webinar dashboard. Of course, this is always a good opportunity to provide feedback if the webinar and the content has been useful, and if there's anything that we can improve and learn for the next webinars. As I already mentioned, this webinar is under the umbrella of ECO's topDNS initiative. And if you're not familiar with the initiative, it's an industry-led initiative to fight DNS abuse and content-related harms. This initiative was founded in 2022. And what we are basically doing is to bring together the different intermediaries across the stack, from registries, registrars, DNS providers, CDNs, but also hosting cloud service providers, etc., to bridge the gaps and to break down the silos, to have all infrastructure actors across the stack have a proper conversation how to improve mitigation of abuse and content-related harms, and share good and best practices, and also to engage with policymakers. So how do we do this? So topDNS is publishing on a monthly basis abuse reports for ISPs. We have this best practice webinar series on a regular basis, and topDNS is also holding regular workshops with industry professionals, but also with policymakers like the European Commission on a regular basis in Brussels. Last but not least, we have a number of sponsors who are supporting this initiative, but also supporters from the hosting and the broader industry. And they are also setting up the steering committee, where you can see some familiar faces of this initiative. And if you would like to learn more, please visit our website or send me an email. And last but not least, before we finally dive into substance, I would like to um, make you familiar with the next opportunities to engage. So this week on Wednesday, there will be a webinar held by the ICANN ISPCP constituency, the ASEC and the OCTO about DNS blocking. There will be on the 19th of May the next edition of this best practice webinar series with a trusted network initiative on improving abuse handling. And there will be on the 26th of May the next on-site workshop of the topDNS initiative in Stockholm at the Nordic Domain Days, where we will go through the e-evidence directive and how to implement this because it will be come into force in summer this year. And, and last but not least, on the 17th of June, we will hold our regular readout webinars to summarize the highlights and takeaways of the respective ICANN meetings. And with this, I would like to hand over to our speakers, and please give me a moment to change the slide deck. One moment, please. So I hope you can see the slides, and Andre, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lars, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining today. And Lars, thank you very much for organizing this and inviting us to this webinar. My name is Andrei Rabachevsky, and today we'll be talking about something that sits at the very foundation of your digital operations, but often overlooked. That is internet routing. And more specifically, we'll look at why routing should be treated as a supply chain risk, what that means for enterprises, and what we can do about it. Next slide, please. So most organizations today have invested heavily in security. Your infrastructure is hardened, your data is encrypted, your identities are protected, and your applications are secured. But there is a gap. The path your data takes across the internet are not under your control, and in many cases, not secure to the same standard. Next slide, please.
Actually, sorry to interrupt. It looks like you're on slide 12 instead of slide 3, where you should be if you could go back.
Yeah, sorry. Excellent, thank you. So next slide, please. So this is really the blind spot. So when the user accesses your application or when systems communicate, the data does not travel directly. It moves across a chain of independent networks. These paths are largely invisible to enterprise security teams, and yet they determine whether your services are reachable, reliable, and trustworthy. Next slide, please. So let's have a quick look at how the internet routing works, the global system that determines the path your data takes. The internet is made up of tens of thousands of independent networks. Each of them makes its own decisions about where traffic should go. Each of them independently builds a roadmap of the internet. They build it by learning about possible paths or routes to the destinations from their neighbors, and then sharing this information further on. This information is exchanged using a protocol called Border Gateway Protocol, or BGP. And just to appreciate how complex such roadmap could be, look at the diagram on the right side of the slide showing an interconnection structure of the real internet. Well, if you zoom in, you will see that each point there denotes a network. And what is also important is that there is no central authority, no global enforcement, and in fact, not one single roadmap of the internet. Each network has its own. So effectively, you're relying on a system that is distributed, loosely coordinated, and outside your control. And yet, it underpins everything you do. Next slide, please. So what's routing risk? The challenge is that routing was not designed with security in mind. There is no built-in authentication. This means that a network can lie, either by mistake or intentionally, about destinations that can be reached through it. And other networks can blindly believe it and spread this false information further, sometimes affecting significant part of the internet. Unless, of course, they deploy necessary routing security controls. And so the roadmap can be distorted, and two main types of incidents can happen. First, a route hijack or misorigination. This is when a network somewhere, maybe on another part of the globe, announces a destination it doesn't host. And traffic is redirected to the wrong place. If this destination, for instance, is the network that hosts your services, they can be impersonated, or it can simply result in an outage. Second type is leaks. This is when a network announces a possible but an unintended path. Effectively, it places itself between the source and destination of the traffic, opening the door for interception, reconnaissance, and other types of man-in-the-middle attacks. Next slide, please. Sorry. Well, these are not theoretical risks. We've seen major incidents affecting well-known companies, causing major outages and destruction. YouTube, Amazon, Google, Cloudflare. In these cases, the issue didn't originate inside the organization. It happened somewhere else on the internet, but the impact was very, very real. In this table, you see several high-profile cases that hear the media headlines, but there are hundreds of incidents happening monthly, and some of them go under the radar, disguised as an outage or service degradation. Next slide, please. When routing fails, business fail it. You lose access to your own assets that are increasingly maintained outside your physical perimeter. Your customers lose access to you. SLAs are breached. Customer trust is eroded. Man-in-the-middle attacks or reconnaissance activities are performed. And importantly, this can happen even when your internal security is strong. Next slide, please. The obvious question, why hasn't this been fixed? Especially since the vulnerability has been known for several decades already. Next slide. The answer is, this is a challenge of adoption and the collective action problem. Every network is responsible for its own security. But implementing best practices costs time and money, and the benefits are shared by everyone. So even if you do everything right, you are still exposed to others who don't. And that's why the problem persists. Next slide, please. Now, this is where the key shift happens. This is not just an internet problem. This is your problem. But what does that actually mean in practice for an enterprise environment? How does this risk show up in real architectures across cloud, SD-WAN, and application delivery? To take us through this perspective, I'd like to hand over to my colleague Matt, who will walk you through how routing risk manifests across different connectivity scenarios. Matt, please.
Thanks, Andre. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think, as we'll show later in the deck, based on data we have, like not enough enterprises are really doing their part to secure the routing infrastructure for their own traffic. And I think maybe one of those reasons, as Andre pointed out, it seems to be this large problem with thousands, 70,000 plus network providers that need to address that. But I think if we instead focus down on the enterprise perspective of this and see this really as a supply chain issue and address this as a supply chain issue directly with the enterprise's suppliers, that can go a long way to reducing the risk associated with route hijacks. You can go to the next slide, please. So who owns the risk at the end of the day? Is it those 76,000, 78,000 networks that Andre mentioned? Certainly they have their part to do as well. Is it as the enterprise, is it your direct connectivity providers, your cloud providers? Certainly they have their part to do as well. But there's also an enterprise piece here as well that you can be doing as an enterprise to improve your own routing security and address that directly with your suppliers. And I think too often this is not seen as maybe a priority by the enterprises. It's not showing up in risk assessments. It may not show up in your SLAs with your connectivity providers if there is a routing security issue, and doesn't have maybe the level of visibility it should within the enterprise, perhaps because they feel there's not enough they can do directly to address that. Next slide, please. But if you look at how, we'll walk through some examples of how enterprises use the network to deliver applications to their customers. When you actually look at how you're using it, the internet suddenly becomes a lot smaller. You're not talking about 70-some thousand internet connectivity providers. If you just look at it from your perspective, how you use the internet, there are actually things you can do to address that directly with your suppliers that will greatly reduce the risk of routing security issues. And I'll walk through some of those. Next slide, please. So if you look at just your suppliers, and how could you enforce routing security contractually with your suppliers, like making sure that the suppliers that you do use implement good routing security to reduce the risk to you. Next slide, please. So a while back, the Manners Plus working group put out a survey to a sort of broad set of enterprises to gauge what the importance of various aspects of traffic security to the enterprises. And the good part of this is if you look at the different aspects of this, whether it's routing security, DDoS protection, anti-spoofing, or others, there is a fairly high level of business value and importance put on this by a broad section of enterprises. But the key is, if you look at this, we rated 5 as being essential, meaning they require this in their contracts. There are probably not enough companies that actually require good routing security in their contracts. And we think one reason for that is how you do that. How do you specify contractually an obligation of your suppliers to deliver strong routing security to you? And we've been looking at what we can do to make that easier for enterprises to move from seeing this as important to seeing this as something they include contractually with their suppliers. Next step, please. Yep. So let's walk through 4 examples of how enterprises use the internet to deliver their applications to their customers, and how addressing routing risk with your suppliers can reduce your risk as an enterprise. Next slide. Okay, so first example is SD-WAN. I think a lot of enterprises are looking at looking at replacing MPLS VPNs with SD-WAN to use lower cost internet to build their tunnels to connect their branch offices back to the rest of their company. And when you look at this, most companies are not using dozens of different suppliers to connect their offices. If you're on one region, maybe it's 2 or 3. Maybe if you're a global company, you're using 5 or 6 different connectivity providers, but it's not the whole internet. And if you could address the routing security risk just with your direct suppliers, you can provide good routing security end to end just by addressing this with your direct suppliers and not having to address it, on a full internet scale. And you can greatly reduce your risk just by addressing that with the companies that you have a contractual commitment from. Next slide. Now, a lot of enterprises are also starting to deliver their customer and partner facing applications out of public cloud providers. And in most cases, this means that the public cloud provider becomes your sole internet provider as well. You're delivering your application over their internet backbone to the ISPs that your customers use. Now, the good part of this is the cloud providers, the big ones, typically have very large networks and very robust peering, which means they are in most cases, one network hop away from your customers. And that's good from a reachability perspective and a performance perspective, but also from a routing security perspective, in that if you can get them to implement strong routing security, you've gone a very long way to reducing the risk of hijacks, because in this case, there's often not 3 or 4 different networks in the path across the internet. And so you have solved the largest part of the problem just by getting your cloud provider to implement strong routing security. Next slide, please. CDNs are very similar to clouds in this regard. So a lot of companies use CDNs to deliver their applications. They have large networks and strong peering. And that means if you can address the routing security risk with your CDN provider, then you have solved a big piece of the routing security problem and greatly reduced the risk of a hijack or a leak impacting your connectivity between your application and your customers and partners. Next slide, please. Now, probably a less common use case today is enterprises that deliver applications out of their private data centers through ISPs to their customers. I think cloud and CDN are much more popular, but this is still a way that some enterprises deliver their applications. I think when you first look at this, you think, well, this is a case where there tend to be more internet providers in the path. And that can certainly be true, but our experience is when you look at a given region, there aren't a dozen different ISPs that customers are using in a given region. There tend to be 3 or 4 really popular ISPs. Now, if you can get direct connectivity to those ISPs, have a contractual relationship with them, you can, by just addressing 3 or 4 or 5 different suppliers and getting strong routing security there, you can actually do a big piece of reducing that risk, even in this scenario that seems like the risk is maybe a bit higher. So I mentioned this earlier. So one thing that ISPs and cloud providers can do to improve routing security is deploy something known as RPKI source filtering. And this provides very good protection, particularly against route hijacks. And the good part is lots of ISPs and cloud providers have done this, some of the big ones, in fact. But in order to take advantage of that as an enterprise, you have to submit these things called route origin authorization objects with your address provider. And so we looked at the top 10 largest companies in each of these sectors and examined how many of their IP addresses they had submitted ROAs for. And what we see is, somewhat surprisingly, like many of these have not fully submitted their ROAs. So in the case of, say, the finance sector, 70% of the top 10 have registered less registered rows for less than half of their total address space. The health sector even lower, automotive a little bit higher. But this is a case of the enterprises being able to do things that would improve their routing security, but they're not taking those actions to do that. So there are things that enterprises can do directly. While it may seem like this is a very large collective action problem, based on the way that enterprises use the internet, there are a number of practical things they can do individually that will improve their routing security. And I think, as Andre will talk about in the next section, there are things that we think we can do collectively as a group of enterprises to make it easier for enterprises to require better routing security from their suppliers and reduce the supply chain risk associated with routing security. Andre, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Matt. Yes. So let's talk now about the path forward. What can be done to reduce risks that Matt just mentioned and was talking about? Next slide, please. So today there are clear gaps. There are no standard enterprise requirements for connectivity providers focusing on this particular aspect. No consistent way to verify providers. No procurement language. And even awareness of these issues is low. I think the slide with ROA adoption proves that point. As the result, there is no clear demand for routing security, no real accountability, insufficient improvements. And the collective action, don't forget about that, it still remains, although there are clear improvements in big part thanks to efforts like Manus. Next slide, please. So let us talk a bit about this foundational problem first. And Manus, which stands for Mutually Agreed Norms for Routing Security, I just mentioned. Manus is an industry-led initiative that was launched a bit more than a decade ago to address the collective action problem. It does this by defining global baseline, simple, agreed practices that significantly reduce routing risks if applied broadly, and by growing number of network operators who implement these practices. And their commitment is being continuously measured, so it's demonstrable commitment. Next slide, please. The routing system is quite diverse. There are different types of networks, and for each of them, the baseline requirements are slightly different to maximize impact. Where for the ISPs, for instance, the focus is on protection of their customer code, for internet exchange points, the biggest impact could be achieved by protecting the peering infrastructure between the members. Next slide, please. Well, this is the adoption curve across all the programs that I just mentioned. And since its launch in 2014, Manus shows strong adoption across the ecosystem globally. Next slide, please. And you can see the effect. On this chart, the dark blue and orange field lines show the monthly amount of routing incidents and culprits, the networks that cause them. The blue and green lines show the level of adoption of security practices and Manus. And as you can see, the number of attackers and incidents is decreasing, and the global routing system becomes more resilient and secure. Although it's hard to prove causation, there is a clear correlation between this trend and Manus adoption. Next slide, please. You may think of Manus as a lightweight global compliance framework. And this is a baseline on this slide that applies to network operators. But it's still a minimum baseline. It's not a best current practice. And for enterprises, this is not enough. Next slide, please. So while Manus is essential, it does not yet provide the level of assurance enterprises need. And some of the requirements important for enterprises are outside the scope. Next slide, please. This is where the next step comes in. Matt mentioned Menace Plus. It was on the slides and connectivity scenarios that he demonstrated. And Menace Plus is again a higher level framework that aims to define enterprise-grade routing security. Stronger requirements, broader coverage, and more importantly, measurable assurance. So that routing security becomes something you can require, verify, and enforce. Next slide, please. The Menace Plus working group has completed work and defined the controls. This is what good starts to look like: a structured set of controls and capabilities across routing, DDoS attack mitigation, security services, and operations. A concrete set that enterprises should expect from their connectivity provider in order to minimize their risks. Next slide, please. So the capabilities and controls are on the side of a connectivity provider and are well understood. But what does it mean for enterprises? For enterprises, this is about moving from awareness to action. Next slide, please. So assess your exposure, integrate routing into risk frameworks, and require it from providers. In practical terms, organizations should start treating routing security risk as any other risk of their supply chain, much like you treat your software or ICT supply chains. This is not only an issue of concerning your network operations team, it is an integral part of your overall security posture. Next slide, please. And to make it more concrete, these are simple but critical actions an organization might take to achieve this objective. Implement best routing practices internally. Include routing in vendor risk and require controls, well, for instance, Menace Plus controls in contracts. But this raises a key question. What exactly should those requirements be? What exactly should language be? This is where we need to move as a community. Next slide, please. Routing security will not improve without demand. And that demand has to come from enterprises, from organizations that use connectivity provider, have contractual relationship with those connectivity providers. Next slide, please. So I hope we convinced you that routing security is part of supply chain risk. But today, there is no clear enterprise-defined standard. To bridge this gap, we are bringing together a small group of enterprise leaders to define what good looks like in a way that is practical, auditable, and usable in procurement. Next slide, please. Joining this group, why should you consider joining this group if you are working for an enterprise and you would like to minimize this risk? This is really an opportunity to ensure that requirements reflect real enterprise needs. We showed you the Menace Plus set of requirements, but they have not been validated by enterprises to ensure good alignment. Influence how providers are evaluated, create accountability, and strengthen the ecosystem you depend on. And who are we looking for? We're looking for senior practitioners from security, network, and risk teams at enterprises. Next slide, and I think that's the last slide of this presentation. So let me close with this. Routing security will become part of how your providers are evaluated. The question is, will you help define those expectations or adapt to them later? Well, thank you very much for listening, and we're very much interested to continue this conversation with you after the webinar. Thank you.
First of all, thank you very much, Andre, and thank you very much, Matt, for giving this presentation on manners. And even though that this is not always in the narrow scope of topDNS, I think it's very complementary and a great addition to what we are doing at topDNS to create a full picture of how to increase the level of security on the internet in general. One question that came to my mind, and to all participants, I would like to open the floor to ask questions. But one question that I have for you is, what are the typical excuses for non-adoption?
I personally think, there's a saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease, and I think, when you look at threats to enterprises, I think enterprises see things like DDoS attacks on a weekly, maybe monthly basis, and those things tend to get the attention from the enterprises. I think route hijacks, route leaks are things that are less frequent, and so they tend to hold the attention of enterprises less. But when they do happen, they can be major issues that do then get attention. But I think a lot of it just has to do with how often different types of events happen, and other things just draw attention away.
I can maybe add that from sort of my experience talking to network operators and enterprise network teams, another obstacle is sometimes security teams are disconnected from network operations teams, and network operations team understands the problem, the issue, but as we said, in many cases, routing security incidents, they go under the radar. They're not recognized as like ransomware attack or DDoS, which are very visible and very pronounced, if I may. So routing requires some analysis, it requires expertise to be able to detect those attacks, analyze them. And they're also not very long lasting, right? Routing attack can last for several hours, maybe, and then usually it's being detected and fixed. But those 2 hours may be very critical for your operation. So lack of this awareness, lack of visibility of this problem inside the organization, I think one of the problems next to what Matt mentioned.
So what I have learned is, so before I joined ECO as an association, I was working for an ISP as well. And from that time, one of my key takeaways was that pain might still be one of the key learning mechanisms in that regard. And so some things never change, but as you have clearly demonstrated in your slides, there is a clear correlation between the adoption and also the reduction of harms monitored. So I think this is great to see. There are no questions in the questions part, and I don't see any hands raised. So, and another element that was striking to me today was that over the time the audience was still growing and not going down. So you did a really good job in presenting this very interesting and very important topic to us. I've shared a few links on the chat during the webinar, also the link to manners. And of course, as I already mentioned in the introduction, we will share the recording of this webinar and also the slides to everyone who's participating today or has registered and is not currently online. Andre, Matt, do you have any final remarks or any call to action to those who are currently online with us?
Yeah, I would like to encourage people, if you're interested in this, to get involved. I think even for organizations who have prioritized this, it's very difficult to specify in contractual language what you're requiring of your suppliers in terms of routing security. I think Manners Plus for us is very exciting as an opportunity to create an enterprise standard that is auditable, that you could just reference in procurement contracts. And I think if we can get a small group of enterprises together to drive this forward, I think this will be a huge benefit to all enterprises globally. So I would encourage you to get engaged here.
Yeah, I can add that Manus Plus work as far as connectivity providers are concerned was completed. It was very productive work that happened a few years, I think almost 2 years. And now we need to close the loop and we need to bring enterprises on board. So we have a healthy relationship between enterprises and their connectivity providers of various sorts. And I believe that will affect the overall ecosystem very much. It will also create a business case for routing security, and it will reduce significantly risks that may not be visible to data enterprises. And you see the mail address here. And Lars, thank you very much for sharing additional information, how people can get in touch with us. Please reach out. Please become part of this effort. Would very much like to work with you together to address this problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us today. Also, thank you very much for your attention to the audience and the participants today. Yes, we will share all the information, and I think it's a very important initiative, and everyone who's interested in should reach out to Andre, Matt, and the entire Manus team to move the needle in this regard. I think also from an industry association's perspective, this is crucial and a very important step to make this internet even more secure and reliable. And with this, I would like to take the opportunity to give everyone a few minutes back of the time today. This was very worthwhile, very interesting, and looking forward to welcome you anytime again if you would like to provide an update on your work at Manus. And with this, this session is adjourned. Thank you.